I used to think the woods were peaceful, that they were a place where a person could be alone with their thoughts, where the only things lurking between the trees were deer, squirrels, and the occasional wandering fox. I don't think that anymore. The day had started out perfect, clear blue skies, crisp autumn air, and the scent of pine hanging in the breeze. It was the kind of weather that made you feel alive. I had been planning this solo hike for a while, itching to escape the constant hum of the city and lose myself in the quiet of nature. I wasn't expecting anything difficult, just a well-worn mountain trail, a bit of exercise, and maybe a great view at the summit. Nothing out of the ordinary. When I arrived at the trailhead, the parking lot was mostly empty except for a couple of cars. That was fine by me. I wasn't here for company. I checked my gear, water, snacks, first aid kit, and my phone fully charged, even though I didn't expect to use it. I preferred the experience of hiking uninterrupted, no buzzing notifications, or the temptation to check messages. Just me, the trees, and the sound of my boots crunching against dirt. The first hour of the hike was exactly what I had hoped for. The trail wound through towering pines and golden aspens, leaves crunching underfoot as I followed the familiar rhythm of my breath and movement. I passed a few hikers heading back down, exchanged polite nods, but didn't stop to chat. The solitude was part of the appeal, but as I got deeper into the woods, something changed. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds, which had been chirping all morning, had stopped. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the air thick with silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful kind of quiet, either. It was unnatural, as if the whole forest was waiting for something. Then, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A flicker, a shadow between the trees. I stopped, scanning the underbrush, but there was nothing there. Probably just my imagination. I kept walking, telling myself I was overthinking things. Then I heard it, a single twig snapping somewhere behind me. I froze. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch or a small animal scurrying through the leaves. It was deliberate, heavy, human. I turned around slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was no one there. I swallowed the unease creeping into my gut and kept moving, picking up my pace slightly. The trail started to descend into a ravine, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The trees here were thicker, the shadows longer. Every instinct in me was screaming that something wasn't right, but I kept pushing forward, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then I saw him. A man was standing just off the trail ahead, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even hiking, just standing there. I stopped in my tracks. There was something deeply unsettling about him. His posture was too still, too rigid. His face was expressionless, eyes wide open, but empty, like he wasn't really seeing anything at all. A sick feeling crawled up my spine. I considered turning back, but that meant retracing my steps through the silence, through the feeling of being followed. I could keep moving forward, pretend I hadn't noticed him, but what if he followed me? I forced myself to take a breath and started walking again, acting as if I hadn't seen him, as if I were just another hiker passing through. My pulse pounded with every step. I moved quickly, keeping him in my peripheral vision. He didn't move. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, but not mine. They were behind me now, matching my pace. I didn't look back. I didn't want to look back. My only thought was get out of here. I walked faster, resisting the urge to break into a full sprint, but the footsteps behind me did the same, quickening, closing in. My breath hitched, and then, suddenly, they stopped. I risked a glance over my shoulder. There was nothing there. The trail was empty, the trees still, the silence thick enough to suffocate. I should have felt relieved, but the air around me felt charged, as if something was still there, just beyond my sight, just waiting. I pushed forward, refusing to stop, refusing to acknowledge the way my hands trembled at my sides. By the time I reached the summit, the sun was already beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows over the valley below. Normally, I would have taken a moment to enjoy the view, to soak in the stillness. But all I could think about was getting back down. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were running. I didn't hesitate. I bolted. The trail twisted and turned beneath my feet, the rocky ground threatening to trip me with every frantic step. I didn't care. I ran faster, ignoring the burning in my legs, the stitch forming in my side. And the footsteps behind me kept pace. They weren't heavy. They weren't clumsy. They were smooth, deliberate. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, but I kept running. Then, finally, voices. Up ahead, a group of hikers was making their way down the path. I practically crashed into them, breathless, my hands shaking. They looked at me in confusion, asking if I was okay. I turned around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow between the trees, just the empty trail behind me, stretching back into the darkening woods. The hikers hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. They thought maybe I had imagined it, that I had let my nerves get the better of me. I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. But as we walked back together, something gnawed at me. I had heard those footsteps. I had felt someone behind me. And when I had finally looked, there had been nothing there. By the time we reached the parking lot, night had fully fallen. The group of hikers got into their cars, chatting casually about their plans for the evening. I climbed into my own, locking the doors the second I was inside. Before I drove away, I glanced back at the treeline one last time, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. Watching, waiting. I hit the gas and didn't stop until I was miles away. I haven't gone hiking alone since, and I don't think I ever will. Was it just paranoia? Or was something really out there? If you were in my shoes, would you have stopped to talk to the man on the trail? Or would you have run sooner? They say the wilderness has a way of swallowing people whole. You hear stories of hikers vanishing without a trace, their campsites left untouched, their footprints leading nowhere. I never used to put much stock in those tales, until it almost happened to me. It started like any other hiking trip. I'd been hiking solo for years, and this was just another weekend away from the city, a way to disconnect from everything. This time, I had chosen a trail that wasn't well known, a stretch of old wilderness tucked deep in the mountains. The few reviews I found online mentioned its isolation, and that was exactly what I was looking for. I wasn't interested in crowded trails or casual weekend hikers. I wanted silence, space, and the sense of being completely alone. The morning was crisp, the kind of autumn air that makes every breath feel fresh and sharp. The sun sat high in a cloudless sky, and the first hints of fall painted the treetops in gold and rust. It was perfect hiking weather. I parked at the nearly empty trailhead, adjusted my backpack, and set off. The first few miles were easy. The ground was soft beneath my boots, layered with fallen leaves and damp moss. Birds called overhead, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't the only living thing out here. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. But that wasn't unusual. Sometimes nature had a way of settling into its own rhythm, and I welcomed it. But something changed. At first, it was subtle. The usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, distant wind, the occasional rustling in the brush, all faded, leaving only the crunch of my boots against the dirt. The stillness pressed in around me like a held breath. I paused, listening, trying to shake off the sudden unease creeping up my spine. There was no wind, no movement, just silence. I checked my map. According to the route I had memorized, I was exactly where I needed to be. I had planned everything: extra food, a fully charged phone, and a map both on paper and downloaded offline. I wasn't some amateur who'd get lost because I wasn't paying attention. Still, something felt wrong. I pushed forward, telling myself it was all in my head. The trail became narrower, winding through dense thickets where the trees twisted together like skeletal fingers. The deeper I went, the harder it was to shake the sensation that I was being watched. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the trees, just a flicker of something in my peripheral vision. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a crunch of leaves, a single, deliberate step. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. It hadn't been a random noise. It was too deliberate, too close. I spun around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the endless, unmoving forest. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep walking, faster this time. Maybe another hiker had followed me out here. Maybe some animal was nearby. But my gut told me neither of those explanations were right. The feeling of being watched had burrowed deep into my bones, and I couldn't shake it. After another mile, I came across something that made my stomach drop. The trail had changed. I had been following a clear path, well-worn and easy to track. Now, it was almost gone. Overgrown, tangled with roots and thick brush, as if no one had walked it in years. But that didn't make sense. I had just been on this trail minutes ago. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my map again. My fingers felt clammy as I traced the route, trying to pinpoint where I had gone wrong. That's when I noticed something else. The ink was smudged. The lines had blurred, like they had been washed out by water, except it hadn't rained. My map had been folded neatly in my pack, untouched until now. I rubbed my thumb over the paper, but the ink was still there, just illegible. I took a deep breath and told myself to focus. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to turn around, backtrack, and find my way out. But the more I walked, the more unfamiliar everything became. The trees looked different, older, taller, their bark rough and twisted. The air was colder, and the light was dimming even though the sun was still high. Every direction I turned felt wrong. Then I saw it. A cabin. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Nestled between two massive trees. Its wooden walls were weathered and cracked, the roof sagging under time and decay. My first instinct should have been to stay away, to turn back, no matter how lost I was. But something about it pulled me forward. The door was slightly ajar. I knocked once, twice. No answer. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and something else. Something faintly metallic, like rust. A fireplace sat in the corner, ashes scattered in the hearth, as if someone had been there recently. But there were no footprints, no signs of life. Then I saw the paper. A small, yellowed note, lying on the floor near the fireplace. The handwriting was frantic, the words scrawled unevenly across the page. Don't follow the trail past the cabin. It watches. It waits. My blood ran cold. I dropped the note, my pulse thundering in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were inside. A floorboard creaked behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, but there was nothing there. I bolted. Bursting out of the cabin, I sprinted down the overgrown path, my breath ragged and burning in my chest. The woods around me blurred into a mess of tangled branches and shifting shadows. I ran until my legs threatened to give out, until the cold air seared my lungs. Then, suddenly, the trail was there, wide, open, just as I remembered it. My car was visible in the distance, parked exactly where I had left it. The forest behind me was just that, a forest. Normal, quiet, like nothing had ever happened. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I never told anyone what happened that day. Who would believe me? But I know one thing for certain. I never took that trail again, and I never will. What do you think was out there in the woods? A trick of the mind? Something ancient? Something waiting? Would you ever hike alone again? I always thought I was a good hiker. Not an expert, but experienced enough to handle myself in the mountains. I'd trekked rugged trails in Vermont where I grew up and had explored the remote paths of Switzerland since moving there. I loved the solitude, the sense of pushing my limits, of disconnecting from the world. That's how I ended up on the Egg Whe Pass hike, a route I'd never done before. It wasn't on the usual tourist maps, but a local hiker had mentioned it offhand, calling it untouched, wild, and not for beginners. I wasn't a beginner, so I figured I could handle it. The night before, I meticulously packed my bag, a map, compass, plenty of water, protein bars, a first aid kit, flashlight, and my multi-tool. I checked the weather, clear skies, no storms, and set my alarm early. The plan was to complete the 8-hour round trip and be back at my car well before dark. That morning, I parked at the empty trailhead just as the sky turned from pink to gold. No other cars, No other hikers. Perfect. I locked my car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and stepped onto the trail, excited for the day ahead. For the first few miles, everything went smoothly. The trail wound through dense pine forests, the scent of damp earth filling the crisp morning air. Birdsong echoed through the trees, and my boots crunched rhythmically over gravel. The solitude was refreshing. An hour in, I reached a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I paused, snapped a few photos, took a sip of water, and moved on. The higher I climbed, the wilder the terrain became. The trees thinned, replaced by jagged rock formations and patches of lingering snow. The trail markers became scarce, and I relied on my map, navigating by natural landmarks and the occasional cairn. It was slow going, but I wasn't worried. Not yet. Then, I reached an unexpected fork. Neither path looked right. The left fork dipped downward into the unknown, disappearing behind a rocky outcrop. The right fork climbed sharply into a loose scree field, steep and unstable. My map showed an alpine lake ahead, but I couldn't see it from here. After a moment's hesitation, I chose the left path, reasoning that the lake might be nestled in a lower valley. 15 minutes in, I realized I'd made a mistake. The trail vanished beneath my feet, dissolving into a mess of rocks and brush. There was no lake, no signs of a path, just silence. I turned around and climbed back to the fork, frustrated but still calm. The right path had to be the correct one, but as I scrambled up the scree slope, my footing became treacherous. The loose rocks slid beneath me, forcing me to grab at tufts of grass and protruding boulders. My legs burned with the effort. The air grew thinner. The climb felt like it went on forever. When I finally reached the top, I expected relief. Instead, I felt wrong. There was no lake, no trail markers, no sign of where I was supposed to go. Just a barren expanse of jagged stone and snow, stretching endlessly in every direction. I checked my watch. 4 hours in. If I didn't find the trail soon, I'd have to turn back to beat the sunset. But just as I debated my next move, I saw something up ahead, a trail of footprints in the snow. Relief flooded me. Someone else had been here, someone who knew the way. I quickened my pace, following the footprints as they climbed higher into the mountains. I didn't think to question why they seemed so fresh. Then, they stopped, abruptly, at the edge of a sheer drop-off. My stomach churned. There were no prints leading away, just a straight path, ending in nothingness. I backed away, my pulse hammering. Whoever left these footprints had either turned around without leaving a trace or fallen. For the first time that day, I felt something close to fear. I scanned the landscape. No signs of another hiker. No voices. No distant figures moving in the distance. Just me and the wind howling through the peaks. My phone had no signal. My battery was half dead from taking photos earlier. I needed to go back. Now. But as I turned, my heart dropped. Nothing looked familiar. The landscape had shifted, as if the mountains had rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. I tried to retrace my steps, but every path led me in circles. The hours dragged on. Frustration turned into exhaustion. I cursed myself for not bringing a GPS, for not sticking to a marked trail. I felt like the mountains were swallowing me whole. Then, the sun began to dip. I was running out of time. I spotted a cluster of boulders near a ridge and decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, exposed, freezing, but it was better than stumbling through the dark. I built a small fire, trying to conserve my supplies. The heat was a temporary comfort, but it didn't ease the growing unease in my chest. The darkness felt alive. That night, I didn't sleep. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind that whistled through the rocks, made my skin crawl. I kept imagining something moving just outside the firelight, shifting in the shadows. Morning couldn't come fast enough. At first light, I extinguished the fire and set out again. My water supply was running dangerously low, and my legs felt like lead. I told myself that as long as I kept moving, I'd find my way out. But the more I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. I told myself it was irrational, just exhaustion, hunger, and panic playing tricks on my mind. But that feeling never went away. Finally, just as the sun began to set again, I saw something in the distance. Smoke? My heart leapt. I stumbled toward it, nearly crying with relief when I saw the outline of a cabin nestled in the trees. I pounded on the door, half expecting it to be abandoned. To my shock, an elderly man opened it. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. He didn't speak much English, but he understood enough. He offered me water, a seat by his fire, and a night's rest. I didn't ask why he was living alone in the middle of nowhere. I was just grateful. The next morning, he led me down a narrow, hidden path, one I never would have found on my own. It took us hours, but eventually, I saw the dirt road where I had parked. When I turned to thank him, he was already walking back up the trail. I haven't attempted a hike like that since. I still don't know what happened to the person who left those footprints. Maybe they made it out. Or maybe something else was waiting for them at the edge of that drop-off. Would you have turned back at the first sign of something off? Or would you have pushed on like I did?